So last time we began our study in metaphysics, when we philosophized about the nature of the physical realm that involves the question as to whether there is anything beyond the physical realm that either interacts with the physical or even informs the physical, or in the case of mind, may even be affected by the physical. We said that there are three broad camps. Two fall under the name monism, holding that all of reality amounts to one kind of stuff at the end of the day. Idealism, or what some have informally called mindism, holds that at the end of all things, matter ultimately is an illusion, or it all exists within the mind, that ultimate reality comes back to an all-encompassing mind, or everything is reducible to ideas, conceptions, or ideals of the mind. Philosophical materialism, sometimes called philosophical naturalism, holds that everything ultimately reduces to the physical stuff or the material stuff, and that there are no immaterial things interacting with the material world and its natural processes. Metaphysical dualism, on the other hand, holds that ultimate reality includes two types of stuff, and so our experience involves both the physical and the immaterial, and there is or may be some interaction between the two. As it relates to questions of mind and body, reductive materialists attempt to reduce the idea of mind to some sort of physical phenomena. So consciousness emerges from brain, which is really just processing the body in its environment. Substance dualism, on the other hand, argues that we are made of two different types of stuff. Our substance includes an immaterial and a material component, a mind and a body. The mind is not the same as the brain. As Descartes said, there is the I, the self, the individual soul, that is nothing like the body, and yet somehow is here interacting with it. So the first question is, what is the mind? And the second becomes, for the substance dualists, how does mind interact with body? How does body affect mind, or how does mind affect body? And for the materialists, it becomes, how is consciousness explainable from a body-only perspective? There's also the problem of identity, which we looked at the other day, which may be more of a problem for the materialists than for the dualists. But you'll have to ponder that for yourself as we move along. Our emphasis today is on building the case in defense of substance dualism, and then contrasting this with the case for reductive materialism. So critics might see substance dualism as a sort of Trojan horse, in which we begin to speak about the body and its experience within the physical world, in a world in which all things seem to work off of mechanistic laws of nature. And then, bam, suddenly we unleash this non-material thing that is not empirically verifiable, that is said to drive this physical body through its physical experiences and imbue the body and the experiences within the physical world with an immaterial significance. So the empiricist would say the rationalist is smuggling in the existence of something that cannot be empirically verified. So let's put Descartes before Deshorse and see what he has to say. According to Cartesian dualism, the main characteristic of physical things is extension, length, height, width, and minds are clearly different than physical things. An idea has no length, cannot be weighed. The human being is a fusion then of body and mind. But the self, the I, the thing of which we can be most certain, because it is the most clear and distinct aspect of ourselves, is a pure mind, and even, on some views, as Descartes, an immortal soul. In the words of C.S. Lewis, you don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. Of course, then the question arises, if everything in the physical world, so far as we can tell, seems to work in a mechanistic way, and the I is nothing like the body, which is part of the physical world, then is the I not simply like a ghost trapped within the machine? All we are able to do is sit back and watch what happens to us? For how could an immaterial self ever cause anything to happen within the physical world? Descartes' argument was essentially this: it is conceivable that I exist without a body. Whatever is conceivable is logically possible. If it is logically possible that I can exist without my body, then I am therefore not identical to my body. Now, this is a powerful argument, to be sure, but those who challenge Descartes critique his first premise, insisting that it is uncertain or questionable as to whether or not it is conceivable that I exist without my body. One criticism is that if Descartes is right, then minds have no physical attributes, not even location in space. In that case, you would not be able to do anything except for think. You wouldn't be able to communicate with others unless you were given some sort of telepathic ability. But even then, it is unclear as to how you would identify them, for they too would have neither body nor location in space. How would you know there was another mind there? And if that were possible, how would you identify one mind from another? On Descartes' view, if two things are the same, they must share essential properties. Bodies are divisible, minds are not, so they cannot be the same thing. Now, some would argue that actually you can treat epilepsy by severing the connection between brain hemispheres. So does this mean that the mind is divisible? Or is there a category error? If we're dividing the brain hemispheres, is it the case that mind and brain are not the same? And so brain is divisible, but mind is not? But then we have a different sort of problem. How does the mind interact with the brain? How is it possible that dividing part of the brain can affect the mind? The other side of this is the question of how the mind can affect the body. So other critics challenge that Descartes' theory is not compatible with the scientific principle that the world is a closed system of physical causes. If this is true, then there's no need for mental causes. If the natural world is a closed system, then all physical effects are caused by physical causes. What do you think? Of course, it is worth recalling Immanuel Kant's point that our empirical observations make little sense without some pre-established framework, rational framework for interpretation. So then the question is, what is it within us that is doing the interpreting? To understand Kant's view, we use the analogy of a computer. That's fitting this week because we will touch on questions of artificial intelligence. Is a computer solely reacting to empirical stimuli, or is it able to become more organic in its interpretation of stimuli? If those Kantian categories require reflection and application, that is not just the product of reacting to changes within our body or within our environments or things like this, will the materialist be able to make an effective case? Anyway, on Descartes' view, although he did not really explain how, the I, or the mind, is able to interact with the physical stuff somehow. So his view is called interactionism or interactive dualism. On this view, our physical stuff and mental, that is non-physical stuff, seem curiously able to affect one another, even if we cannot quite explain how. Our body affects our minds, and our minds can affect our body. Now, Descartes tried to locate the place where this interaction happens, and understanding a great deal about what was known at the time concerning human anatomy, Descartes supposes that it must be the pineal gland where this converging of immaterial and material takes place. Its location really makes sense, and it wasn't really understood what it was for at the time, and so he supposes this is where the mind interacts with the body. We now understand that the pineal gland is not the master switchboard of the brain, as Descartes supposed, but moreover, even if we could find a place within the brain and say, here it is, this is where the magic happens, this is where the information switches between spirit and body, that still would not tell us how it is possible for body to interact with mind or mind to interact with body. To say it another way, the where and the what do not give us the how. And without a reasonable how, some people are doubtful about the where and the what. Though it may be difficult to explain, it's not necessarily difficult to envision. In the words of William Lawhead in his The Philosophical Journey, the phone rings, causing electrical signals to be sent to the brain, brain state 1. These electrical signals cause other brain states, such as brain state 2, which produce the sensation of sound in the mind, mental state A. This mental event causes, now that's the big question, causes more brain activity, such as brain states 3 and 4, which causes the mental event of recognizing that the phone is ringing, mental state B. This mental event or thought causes the desire to pick up the phone, mental state C. This mental desire leads to the mental act of willing to pick up the phone, mental state D. And this mental act sets in motion further brain activity, such as brain state 5, which causes your hand to pick up the phone. The physicalist alternative would seem to be, if there is no mind, or if there is no room for mind to affect brain, that all we have is a series of brain states and nothing more that lead us to pick up the phone. Well, Descartes set the dialogue in motion, but his is not the only perspective that has been offered. According to EPIPHENOMENALISm, physical states can give rise to mental states, but mental states cannot affect physical states. Bodies and brains might produce conscious thoughts within our spirit minds. However, our spirit minds have no control over our bodies and brains. One problem with this view is that it doesn't really solve the interaction problem. It only lessens the options. Now it doesn't have to explain how the mind interacts with the body, but it still needs to explain how the body interacts with the mind. Moreover, it seems counterintuitive to many to say that my mind has no control over my behavior. Rather than believing that physical and spirit realms are radically different with no overlapping areas, gradualism holds that body and spirit are made of the same kind of stuff, but that they differ only in degrees on the spectrum of lightness and heaviness. This idea comes from Lady Anne Conway, a British philosopher from the early Enlightenment. So imagine a spectrum, and on one end you have the lightest sorts of spirits, and on the other end you have the heaviest sorts of physical bodies. Well, directly in the middle, you would have heavier spirits and lighter physical bodies. This place in the middle is where she says the body and the mind interact. And if you think about wind, it makes a lot of sense. In the same way that a heavy gust of wind can move tree limbs or a windmill, she argues, so too, a heavy spirit could easily move a lighter body. Now, she did not really go into the how either, but some have speculated that it might work something like muscles and bones have a heavier sort of body, and nerves have a medium body. Electrical charges have the lightest sort of physical body, and from there we move on over into energy itself. That's not necessarily an electrical charge, and here we might be talking about auras, or a heavy spirit, or the sort of energy that's attributed to a sort of sixth sense. Like there's a lot of negative energy, or I can sense that somebody in the next room is talking about me, kind of thing. And beyond this heavier sort of spirit energy, you have a medium sort, the conscious mind itself. So this speculation might be satisfying to some, but for others the problem is it's just that, it's speculation. Then there's parallelism. On this view, bodies and spirits operate in their own realms, having no causal connections or interactions with one another, and yet somehow my mental experiences and physical events occur simultaneously within both realms. Here, our sci-fi films may help us a bit. Imagine that there are two simultaneously occurring yet non-interacting timelines, the same person in each timeline, yet even though they do not interact, imagine that each person in those two distinct timelines is aware of what's happening in the other timeline as it happens, because really the same things are happening in both timelines, but in one timeline you are a spirit experiencing those things within a spirit realm, while in the other timeline you are a physical body experiencing those things within a physical realm. On this perspective, there is no signal that is transferring between realms that we have to figure out. There is no causal connection to be explained. Rather, there is an intertwined awareness of events occurring simultaneously in separate realms. This idea comes from German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. So on this view, we can imagine two parallel universes, one which is composed completely of physical things, and the other which is made entirely of spirit things, even though those spirit things may strangely resemble material things. We might see weird spirit rocks or spirit trees. And this is really not hard to imagine thanks to contemporary film. Sometimes when someone is having an out-of-body experience or maybe an afterlife experience, rather than just having no background, the films depict people in bodies, though they are seemingly see-through bodies, standing in environments that appear somewhat see-through or less full or substantive, you might say. Leibniz suggests that these universes are completely in sync with one another. The only difference is their composition. In one universe I have an unconscious body, in the other I have a conscious mind, but there is no need for the two to interact since they are completely in sync with one another. So imagine that in the physical realm, my material body is walking through the woods and then comes across a snake. The physical sense datum triggers mechanical reactions, and my brain tells my body to run. My body runs. Simultaneously, within the spirit realm, I see in my mind my body walking. I see the snake. I experience fear. I desire to run. And then, in my mind, I see my body running away to safety. While this view may escape the problem of having to explain how the mind affects the body, alas, it too is speculative, and some have even challenged that if we have two universes that are independent of one another, you don't really need the other. You can just focus on the one. And it seems to be only the physical to which we have access for investigation. MYSTERIANISm simply claims that the question of consciousness is unsolvable by human minds due to the compartmentalized nature of our minds. We simply do not possess the ability to access and explain subjective experience in a reductive materialist manner and language. On the theistic view of substantialism, the human being consists of body, which includes brain, a mind, accounting for the majority of mental experiences, but also a soul, the principle that guides reason. On the view of medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, there is a soul substance, an intellectual, immortal, spiritual reality which involves characteristics and qualities most akin to God. When theists speak of the image of God, they are speaking of the soul. Other theists would argue, however, that the image of God involves the mind. So although it is popular to hear many people speak of a tripartite being consisting of body, spirit, and mind, there is some disagreement within this camp of metaphysical dualism as to whether the soul, or the I, and the mind are the same, or whether soul and mind are two different things. Okay, now let's look at the case for the materialist view of mind. But first, food for thought, let's ponder a delimitation. Materialism rules out dualism. Does this mean that it necessarily rules out God? Well, according to John Locke, it is possible that God could have made material bodies that give rise to a limited consciousness. Locke's view opened the door for many religious philosophers after him to embrace materialism without feeling as though they needed to reject their faith in order to do so. Of course, many theists argue against the reductive nature of materialism. So I leave that with you to ponder as we move on. Hard evidence suggests that personality is affected by what happens to the body. Probably the most powerful and famous example involves a guy named Phineas Gage.
It all started in Vermont on September 13, 1848, when Phineas Gage, a railroad foreman, was in the process of blasting some rock during railroad construction. In order to do this, he drilled a hole and filled it with gunpowder. Typically, the next step in this process would be to put some sand in the hole so the gunpowder blasts the rock safely when you slam the iron rod in it. However, for unknown reasons, Phineas did not complete that step, and a spark from the iron rod hitting the bottom of the hole ignited the gunpowder. This launched the rod into his skull from under his cheekbone, behind his eye, out the top of his head. This damaged his left frontal lobe and knocked him off his feet. Surprisingly, Phineas never lost consciousness and actually walked to a carriage that proceeded to take him to the hospital. For the entire mile-long journey, Phineas was completely conscious, talking, and even sat upright. When he arrived at the hospital, he famously said to John Harlow, the doctor who saw him, "Here's business enough for you," and he wasn't joking. Basically, with the amount of destruction in his head, it's miraculous Phineas didn't die. Gage did get an infection a few days after he arrived at the hospital, which led him to fall into a coma. He also lost all vision in his left eye. Several weeks later, though, he returned to his home and brought the iron rod with him. When he returned back to work, his friends noted that he was no longer Gage. Whereas before he was calm, smart, and professional, Gage was now moody, profane, violent, and uncontrollable. Due to this change in behavior, Gage lost his job as a railroad foreman.
Does this cause a problem for dualism? If the mind were not part of the body, then it would seem damage to the body would not affect the mind. So why, in this case, does damage to the brain cause a change in the mind? Here's another example.
I remember we were having a barbecue and a little party.
Hey Derek, go along, dude.
We started throwing a football around, and then all of a sudden it turned into catching it over the water. I remember running and diving, and I even remember turning to catch the football. I hit the bottom immediately.
A simple mistake of catching the football and landing in the shallow end because he misjudged the depth of the pool.
I remember the impact being very loud. It was like a bomb had gone off. And I knew I hit my head hard enough that I was hurt. I knew I was hurt badly.
The force of the impact triggers billions of neurons to release chemicals in the brain. These neurotransmitters are how neurons send signals, but a flood of meaningless signals burns out brain cells.
Wasn't a pretty sight to see him. disoriented. He was not normal.
A chain reaction of neurotransmitters, ions, blood, and glucose creates energy fluctuations inside Derek Amato's head.
I thought my ears were bleeding. Felt like they were pouring with blood.
That night, Derek Amato was taken to the hospital and treated for a concussion.
He was very lethargic. His speech wasn't normal. His balance did not seem normal.
My head was swollen up. Couldn't hear out of my left ear very well. About 4 or 5 days after my accident, I was constantly, my mind was racing for some reason. I went over to see Rick, my best friend, and that had known me for years and years. For some reason, I felt compelled to sit down at the keyboard.
Derek had never played the piano before.
And I just began to play.
He played till about 2 o'clock in the morning. I sat there and just listened to him.
It was no Mary Had a Little Lamb. It was a fully structured piece. And Rick looked at me. He said, "What's going on?"
He says, "I just don't understand it, Rick."
So again, this seems a perplexing thing if the mind is not directly connected or derivative of a physical body. There are other examples to consider. Alcohol causes impairment of the mind. Now, some might say that worry causes ulcers, so in that case you have the mind affecting the body. And maybe that's the case, but it could easily be argued that stress is foremost a physiological response that the mind is aware of, or the brain is processing. So it's not clear just because worry can cause ulcers that it's an immaterial thing affecting the physical body. And yet there may be something to it because, for example, working out in the gym, you say no pain, no gain. The idea is that your mind can trick your body into enduring more than it thinks it can. So maybe it does work both ways. I'll leave it to you to ponder for now. Let's look at the cases for materialism. Attacking Cartesian dualism as the ghost in the machine, Gilbert Ryle held to a theory of behaviorism. On this view, all we can ever know about the human mind is what we can observe about how the body responds to different external stimuli. On this view, your mental state is reducible to a behavioral disposition. If I hand you a puppy, you smile. I understand that your mental state is happiness. If I hand you an F on a term paper, you frown. I understand that your mental state is unhappiness or sadness. So we watch what you do, and we understand your mental states. A problem with this, however, is that it does seem that there are certain experiences that are only accessible to us. Not everything that I experience is displayed in my behavior. This may ring especially true amongst certain introverted personality types. And in many ways it seems counterintuitive. It does seem for many of us that there are many things that we experience that are not simply the result of some environmental stimuli. Whereas behaviorism focuses on behavior, identity theory focuses on the brain. According to identity theory, mental states are identical to physical brain states. Yet the language we use to describe mental experiences are nevertheless useful in communication. When we experience a sunset and we exclaim, "What a beautiful sunset!" this can still be a meaningful statement, even though, in actuality, all it means is that we are experiencing a particularly enjoyable sensation within our brain. Now, it might have been more directly effective to just say, "Ah," or "Wow." But the language is still effective. We understand when they say, "What a beautiful sunset," that all they really mean is, "Wow." They like that. It gives them the good vibes, and we get that. There's a problem, however. If I were watching the sunset and I described it from the perspective of my mental experience, and then we describe it from the perspective of, for example, a researcher who is scanning my brain, if it's true that brain states and mental experiences are the same, identical, that is, then the list describing those experiences should be the same. However, my experience is private, whereas the brain state is publicly observable. When I experience the sunset, my experience is not localizable in space. Yet my measurable brain activity seems to be localizable in space. Moreover, my experience of the sunset is about something. My experience is about the sunset. Whereas my brain activity is not really about something. So the list, if we were to compare these two lists, one is a private experience, non-localized, about something, and the other is a public experience, localized, not about something, just a reflection of what's going on in my brain. These two lists are nothing alike, so how can it be the case that mental experience and brain activity are identical when their descriptors are nothing alike? As philosophers have tried to tweak this theory a bit to make it work, two offshoot theories have been developed. The first is called Eliminative Materialism. According to this view, we should completely remove meaningless language. Mental states are caused by brain activities, period. So the notion that you love someone really just means that you're having something like a section 2J neural state coupled with a little sector 4B activity. And you know, if you believe that, you can try it on a date and see how it goes for you. You never know. I suppose if they reply, and a 2J and 4B to you too, my dear. There you go, you've got a keeper. An interesting problem for the eliminative materialist is when they philosophize about mind, as they love to do. If our mental states are just brain activity, what exactly is being said? When they advance their theories on what the mind is and how mental states work and what brain activities are, what are they saying by their own definitions, other than that they themselves are having an experience in a certain sector of their brain? Another offshoot of identity theory is functionalism. On this view, mental experiences are simply the result of various patterns of stimulus inputs. Since all that mind requires on this view is a processor, and not necessarily a human brain, this means that such a mind could technically arise from non-human mechanisms as well. Consciousness, then, is simply a function of complex processing. So from a materialist perspective, functionalism attempts to situate itself between dualism and identity theory. It denies dualism's assertion that there is a different sort of substance called the mind that is not the same as the brain, and yet it also rejects identity theory's claim that there are no unique mental events because mental activity just amounts to brain activity. Here, the functionalist might draw analogy to a computer. A computer's physical hardware is necessary for the computer to run and necessary for processing data. This we might liken to the brain. And yet the computer's software, the computer program being run on the hardware, is not the same kind of thing as the hardware. This we might liken to the mind. So according to functionalist theory, mental experiences are functional states caused by external stimuli. Now this raises an interesting issue. If that's the case, then mental experience is not dependent upon biology necessarily, but upon external stimuli. Well, you have external stimuli with computer programming. The hardware is the stimulus, the software is the result. So perhaps the only difference between us and computers is the level of complexity that is involved in our processor. And in theory, it is argued, if a computer could account for enough variation and complexity, then perhaps consciousness would emerge as a result. And, well, the same software can run on different computers. So the hardware can change and the software can remain the same. Now recall that identity theory identified mental activity with brain state, so you've got to have a biological brain. Here on functionalism, you don't have to have a biological brain necessarily. You just have to have the right amount of and complexity of external input and processing. So any sort of processor, biological or artificial, might do the trick. And this is the stuff sci-fi films are made of. If the complexity of a machine or computer could match the complexity of our mind, since software programs can be transferred between computers, then in theory we might be able to transfer our consciousness to another vessel, another machine, or maybe even another uninhabited sleeve or human body. In the words of James Fieser from his Great Issues in Philosophy, the functional pattern of operation in a human brain consists of large regions of brain activity, which are composed of subregions and sub-subregions, each of which perform their own mental tasks, from simple ones at the lower level to complex ones at the higher levels. The lowest neurological level simply involves a series of biochemical on-off switches. Consciousness emerges at the higher levels, while at the same time being driven by the lower levels that have progressively less intelligence, on down to the biochemical on-off switches. On this view, the pattern of on-off switches can exist in a variety of non-biological mechanisms, such as computers. Regardless of the mechanism that houses the low-level on-off patterns, mental consciousness will emerge at higher hierarchical levels. This isn't the best example as far as function goes, but as far as how it emerges, I like to compare this to rainbows. If you combine the right amount of light and water in just the right way, there emerges a rainbow, right? In a similar way, again, this is kind of a poor analogy, but in theory, if you were to combine the right mechanistic patterns in the right way within a certain environment, given certain external stimuli, then consciousness would naturally emerge, if the complexity of these things were to a significant degree. Now, there are many problems for functionalism. One of the leading contemporary philosophers of mind, Australian philosopher David Chalmers, has argued that it's conceivable that there are zombies. Now, he's not talking about bodies that come back from the dead, but rather bodies that just walk around mindlessly, reacting to their environment and to their brain states alone. It's conceivable that such things exist. If it is conceivable, then it is metaphysically possible. If it is metaphysically possible that there are zombies like these, then consciousness is non-physical. So consciousness is non-physical. Chalmers' point is to challenge physicalism. We can observe zombies all day long because we can observe brain states and reactions. However, we cannot observe consciousness within the zombie because consciousness does not reside there.
Dave, I've always been fascinated by the concept of existence, and when I think about existence, what that means, I'm always back to consciousness. But then I see some philosophers telling me that consciousness is an illusion, doesn't really exist. You think otherwise.
I think consciousness is the thing we know about more directly than we know about anything in the world. You know, the great philosopher Descartes said, we can doubt the existence of anything in the world. I could doubt that you exist. Maybe this is just a dream. I could doubt that any of the tables and chairs around us exist. I could maybe even doubt the existence of my own body. But the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm conscious right now. You know, I think, I am conscious, therefore I am. My consciousness is presented to me more directly than anything else in the world. If this is an illusion, then the illusion is consciousness.
Some say, okay, that's Descartes, they ridicule him. They say, now that we know about the brain, we know how the neurons work, the spikes of activity, the synapses, the chemical compositions, the complexity, that out of that complexity of 100 billion neurons and trillions of connections, consciousness can emerge. Still an illusion.
Maybe consciousness emerges from something else. I mean, this is a further question downstream, but the number one datum of the science of consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness is there is consciousness. Now, is it a primitive? Is it the first element of reality? Or is it something derivative? Is it sort of a second element of reality that somehow emerges from the brain? Well, that's an open question, at least at the beginning of the discussion. But you can't question that consciousness exists.
Well, you can question that I think consciousness exists and that I seem to have a focal point, but you can show that activity at the brainstem, so-called reticular activating system, makes you focus on visual things or auditory things. So, you know, you think you're this unified consciousness, but really you have these streams of data that you're focusing on, and that's all it is.
I tell you what, I can question your consciousness. I can't be 100% certain that you are conscious right now. Maybe you're just like acting conscious and you're walking the walk, you're talking the talk. Maybe nothing's going on in there. Maybe you're a zombie. I can't question my consciousness. I'm experiencing it directly.
Right,
it's more real to me than anything else.
Tell me about zombies. You've really had a major impact in the philosophy of mind by talking about zombies. It's a funny word, but there's some significance there.
Well, there's a lot of kind of zombies, you know. There's the zombies in the Hollywood movies. I guess they're dead. Yeah. They come back to life. And then there's your Haitian zombies. I guess they've had some kind of voodoo poison. They lack some kind of free will. Yeah. But the zombies that philosophers are concerned with, they're just like you and me, but they lack consciousness. They walk around acting like a conscious being, talking like a conscious being, but they're not conscious.
You stick them with the pin, they say, ow.
Exactly. And you ask them, are you conscious? They say yes. And no one thinks zombies actually exist. I'm not a zombie. I don't think you're a zombie. But we can at least make sense of the idea. They seem to at least be imaginable. You know, you say, could God have created a world with zombies? To use a metaphor here for a second. It seems like God could have done that. Our world is not a world of zombies. We're not robots. We're not automata. We're conscious. That itself is something that needs explanation.
So the fact that you can conceive of a zombie means that there is a possibility of something else being needed to differentiate us from a zombie?
I would say that when God created the world, he could have created a purely physical world, just atoms in the void, no consciousness at all. That would have made sense. That's a logically consistent world. Our world isn't like that. Our world contains consciousness. That suggests that when God created the world, he had to do some more work. He had to put consciousness in. Now, subtract God from the metaphor now and just use this as a way of thinking about what exists in the world. You need the matter, then you need the consciousness.
Okay, now evolutionary theory would say, particularly evolutionary psychology, that during an evolutionary process, consciousness somehow came in, it was selected for, because if we have an awareness in our environment, we can avoid the tigers a little better, maybe plant the crops better, who knows what. But consciousness was a selected factor, maybe it emerged at random, and then developed.
Well, it sounds plausible on the face of it that consciousness plays some role in evolution. The fact is, any story anyone's ever told about the evolutionary story role of consciousness has been quite obscure and doesn't really quite make sense. The trouble is, anything you want evolution to explain, how we react, what we say, and so on, I can find some explanation for how that happens that goes wholly in terms of mechanisms, algorithms in the brain, and so on. Once I spell out that story, we say, why do you need consciousness for that?
So the evolutionary story could have worked with just reflexes, maybe higher level reflexes, but same reflexes, but no inner experience.
A really complicated inner computer, really complicated inner mechanisms. Computers are getting better and better, and maybe one of these days they're going to be able to do all the things that we can do. But then the question is, why do you need consciousness?
Okay, now this brings up the word that philosophers use, qualia. What's qualia?
Qualia is the raw sensation of experience. So I look around me and I see colors, reds and greens and blues, and they feel a certain way to me. I hear the sound of music, a far-off clarinet in the distance, the smell of mothballs. All of these feel a certain way to me. They have a quality of experience, and you've got to experience them to know what they're like. I mean, you could give me the whole map of my brain, what's going on when I see colors, when I smell mothballs, and so on. But if I haven't seen a color for myself, that's not going to tell me about the quality of seeing red, of seeing green, smelling the mothballs. You actually have to experience it for yourself.
You've talked about an advanced scientist who is colorblind but knows every wavelength of every color. And what happens when she finally sees color?
Yeah, so Mary, the famous colorblind neuroscientist, spends her entire life in a black and white room. She's never seen a color, but she learns everything there is to know about the neuroscience of color. The wavelength of the light, the neurons that fire in response, the behavior it gives rise to. She can tell you all about red and green and blue. There's one incredibly important thing about color she just doesn't know. She doesn't know what it's like to see red, to see green. She doesn't know about the conscious experience of red and green. All the brain science in the world isn't going to tell her that. Imagine one day she has an operation. She leaves her room. She says, that's it. That's what it's like to see red. She's learned something new about consciousness.
What follows from that?
That, to me, suggests that there's more to consciousness than a physical process in the brain. Because you could know all there is to know about the physical processes in the brain, and you wouldn't know all there is to know about consciousness.
You've become quite well known for defining the easy problem and the hard problem. Go for it.
So there's a lot of things we want to explain when we explain consciousness. People use the word in lots of different ways. You might want to explain things like how it is that my brain perceives something in the environment, and a stimulus hits my retina, my brain integrates information, I react, I point, I say something. Maybe you could give an explanation of those things in terms of circuits in my brain or algorithms in my brain, but those are just the easy problems of consciousness.
Now, we say easy, they're really hard, but relatively easy.
I'd say, a good century or two of more and more ingenious brain science is going to get us there. We're going to isolate the neural circuits, the computational mechanisms that make us behave the way we behave, do the things we do. The hard problem of consciousness is, why is all that processing accompanied by conscious experience? Why does it feel like something from the inside? Why do we have this amazing inner movie going on in our minds all the time? And it looks like the whole story you tell about neural circuits and computational mechanisms, it just leaves that question out.
Take 1,000 years into the future at the same rapid growth of science, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years. Do you see, in principle, can the hard problem, as you've defined it, be subject to neuroscience analysis?
I don't think the hard problem of consciousness can be solved purely in terms of neuroscience. I think neuroscience has a huge contribution to make to its solution. But if we just stay with the level of neurons and processing alone, there's only so much that's going to explain. Because neurons and neuroscience is all about objective mechanisms that perform functions that ultimately issue in behavior. So if you want to say explain language, explain perception, explain memory, the things we do, the functions of the brain, that's just fine. But it just explains those functions, those behaviors. And that always leaves this further question. Why is that behavior, those functions, accompanied by consciousness? For that, we need an extra ingredient in the picture, I think. We need to bring in consciousness itself, on my view. It's fundamental.
Now, Chalmers mentioned Frank Jackson's thought experiment called Mary's Room, and despite all of her knowledge about what color is and how the brain works and how the brain experiences color, Mary still would have no knowledge about what the experience of color is like, unless she herself had experienced color. So Jackson concludes that if physicalism were true, Mary ought to have gained total knowledge about color perception simply by examining the physical world or other people's brain states. But since there is something she learns only once she has experienced color herself, then physicalism cannot be true. Similarly, Thomas Nagel has asked us, what is it like to be a bat? Bats have some level of consciousness, though radically different from our own. To say that bats have experience is to say that there is something that it is like to be a bat. Now you can learn everything there is to know about bat neurophysiology or bat biology, but there would nevertheless remain something that you could not know, what it is like to be a bat. So how, for example, shall we understand echolocation? We can describe it to the best of our abilities, and we can try to envision what it means, but can we really understand it? Will we try to understand echolocation in the sense of seeing? Or shall we try to understand it in the sense of hearing? Or maybe feeling? And yet it is none of these in isolation. So how could we understand it? The best we could do would be to use the language of our human experience in an effort to try to grasp at naming that other experience. Similarly, we could know all facts about human physical states and still know nothing about human mental states. So it cannot be the case that physical states and mental states are identical. To put it more simply, in the words of Louis Vaughan from his Philosophy Here and Now, is there something that it is like to be a bat? If there is, then we non-bats could never know what it feels like to be a bat despite our expert knowledge of objective bat facts. What does that prove about the plausibility of materialism? In counterpoint to functionalism specifically, recall Chalmers' point. The physical actually gives us no access to consciousness. So why would we conclude then that consciousness is derived from the physical?
What does it mean to be conscious? According to the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, consciousness consists of two fundamental aspects, the objective and the subjective. The objective aspect refers to the observable processes that correlate with conscious mental states, such as, for instance, the firing of neurons in our brain, or even conceivably, the informational states of an artificially intelligent computer. While the subjective aspect refers to what it is like to actually experience being in those mental states. What it is like, for example, to experience the redness of red, or the sensation of pain. Experiences or phenomena which philosophers of mind refer to as qualia. To illustrate this conceptual distinction between objective and subjective, consider the possibility of an automaton that operates in the same way as you or I, but which lacks any subjective awareness of its activities. That such a being is even conceivable reveals that there is a clear distinction between objective and subjective mental states. This can be illustrated further by considering the fact that at times we have all operated like automata, whether it's negotiating traffic while engaged in a deep conversation, eating while engrossed in a movie, or even, for some, sleepwalking. In 1974, in his paper What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, Nagel famously framed this distinction between subjective and objective by proposing that one could know all the objective properties of a bat, such as that it flies, uses echolocation, etc., and yet know absolutely nothing about the subjective aspect of what it is actually like to be a bat. According to Nagel, for any definition of consciousness to be valid, it must explain both the objective and subjective aspects. For this reason, Nagel rejects the attempts of physicalists such as Donald Davidson and Daniel Dennett, who claim that consciousness is nothing more than the underlying physical mental states.
I came across a fascinating expansion of Nagel's argument recently, and if you attended the last lecture, then you know well that I'm a bit of a comic book fanatic. This is Mark Boone, currently an assistant professor of religion and philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. And Boone applies Nagel's question to Marvel's Daredevil character.
Can you really understand what sight is like if you've been blind your entire life, and how much good will hearing do at helping you understand seeing if you've never seen anything? Well, these are the questions Nagel asks. Now, let's ask the question, does Daredevil know what it is like to be a bat? Marvel's Daredevil seems to have the bat's power of echolocation. That's his superpower. Does he know what it's like to be a bat? In the film productions, we get to see things from Daredevil's perspective. And so we get to know what it's like to be Daredevil. At least we think we do. In The Trial of the Incredible Hulk, a made-for-TV film where John Rhys Davies plays the bad guy, Daredevil sees in green. That's what it's like to be Daredevil. And in the Ben Affleck film, he sees in blue. And in the Marvel Cinematic Universe TV show on Netflix, what's it like to be Daredevil? Well, it's seeing a world on fire. It's seen in orange. So if we're really seeing what Daredevil sees, then his perceptual abilities are not much different from ours. He still sees. He sees by hearing, yes, but he still sees. And so he doesn't really have a different perceptual power. If he has a different perceptual power, then the films do not even begin to convey what it is like to be him. Or else Nagel is wrong. But if Nagel is right, then either Daredevil has no idea what it is like to be a bat, or, despite the best efforts of the films, we have no idea what it's like to be Daredevil.
Some have asked if it's the case that the layering arrangement of inputs and outputs can give rise to consciousness, then would it not also be the case that the layering arrangement of conscious inputs and outputs might give rise to a grander scale consciousness? Well, since functionalism is a leading mind-body materialist view, and many take seriously the idea that consciousness can arise from mechanistic structures, many people likewise take seriously the idea that we can create a sense of artificial intelligence that can not only imitate our intelligence, but actually duplicate it. So here it's important to distinguish between strong and weak versions of artificial intelligence. When we say weak artificial intelligence, we mean that we can learn about the mind from studying computers, or computers can be programmed to simulate the mind. That is, to imitate certain aspects of our intelligence. And this may include simple things like autocorrect in your Word document, or more complex things like Siri and Alexa. If someone holds to the perspective of strong artificial intelligence, then they believe computers can be appropriately programmed not just to simulate our intelligence or our mind, but to actually give rise to a mind. Correctly designed computers will literally develop their own consciousness. They will have their own mind, thinking and understanding and believing. Alan Turing, who is considered the father of the modern computer, invented the Turing machine to break unbreakable codes in World War II, and also what is known as the Turing test, which was developed to measure machine intelligence. Now, advocates of strong artificial intelligence believe that computers will eventually be able to pass the test, thus proving that the computer has developed a mind of its own. Now, there have no doubt been many amazing developments in the technology of virtual assistance programs, including features of self-learning and correcting, learning what you like, for instance, in order to advertise more effectively to you. But the test for many advocates of strong AI is that a computer should be able to fool a fully conscious person. If we see no reason to doubt that we're speaking with another person, then why wouldn't we think of them as a person and not a machine?
ELIZA's a computer program that anyone can converse with via the keyboard, and it'll reply on the screen. We've added human speech to make the conversation more clear.
Men are all alike.
In what way?
They're always bugging us about something or other.
Can you think of a specific example?
Well, my boyfriend made me come here.
Your boyfriend made you come here?
He says I'm depressed much of the time.
I'm sorry to hear that you're depressed.
It's true. I am unhappy.
Do you think coming here will help you not to be unhappy?
The computer's replies seem very understanding, but this program is merely triggered by certain phrases to come out with stock responses. Nevertheless, Weizenbaum's secretary fell under the spell of the machine.
And I asked her to my office and sat her down at the keyboard, and then she began to type. And of course, I looked over her shoulder to make sure that everything was operating properly. After 2 or 3 interchanges with the machine, she turned to me and she said, "Would you mind leaving the room, please?"
And yet she knew, as Weizenbaum did, that Eliza didn't understand a single word that was being typed into it.
Yet many people argue that just because a machine is complex enough or efficient enough to fool you, or to fool many people, this does not mean the machine has consciousness. Consider, for example, John Searle's thought experiment called the Chinese Room.
Contemporary American philosopher John Searle constructed a famous thought experiment called the Chinese Room, designed to show that passing for human isn't sufficient to qualify for strong AI. Imagine you're a person who speaks no Chinese. You're locked in a room with boxes filled with Chinese characters and a code book in English with instructions about what characters to use in response to what input. Native Chinese speakers pass written messages in Chinese into the room. Using the code book, you figure out how to respond to the characters you receive, and you pass out the appropriate characters in return. You have no idea what any of it means, but you successfully follow the code. You do this so well, in fact, that the native Chinese speakers believe you know Chinese. You've passed the Chinese-speaking Turing test. But do you know Chinese? Of course not. You just know how to manipulate symbols with no understanding of what they mean in a way that fools people into thinking you know something you don't. Likewise, according to Searle, the fact that a machine can fool someone into thinking it's a person doesn't mean it has strong AI. Searle argues that strong AI would require the machine have actual understanding, which he thinks is impossible for a computer to ever achieve. Thanks, Thought Bubble. One more point before we get out of here. Some people have responded to the Chinese Room thought experiment by saying, sure, you don't know Chinese, but no particular region of your brain knows English either. The whole system that is your brain knows English. Likewise, the whole system that is the Chinese Room, you, the code book, the symbols, together know Chinese, even though the particular piece of the system that is you does not.
So there are arguments on both sides. For Searle, however, in the words of Louis Vaughan, the reason a computer cannot think or understand is that a computer processes symbols by their physical properties, like shape and size and order. And people process symbols by their meaning. That is, computers manipulate symbols syntactically according to what they look like or where they are positioned. People use symbols semantically according to what they mean. In the words of Searle, just having the syntax is not sufficient for having the semantics. Merely manipulating symbols is not enough to guarantee knowledge of what they mean. The world of science fiction has taken us even beyond the questions of artificial intelligence to consider other aspects or avenues of transferring consciousness amidst a perspective of mind-body materialism. Consider, for example, the Netflix series Altered Carbon.
Centuries ago, mankind discovered a way to transfer consciousness into a new body, making death a mere inconvenience. Since then, we've been providing an unparalleled pedigree of human sleep to only the most discerning clientele. Psychosec, live forever in the body you deserve. Your body is not who you are. You shed it like a snake sheds its skin. You transfer the human consciousness between bodies to live eternal life.
How long have I been down?
250 years.
Your body is not who you are. Now that certainly sounds like a substance dualism, doesn't it? Well, if the consciousness has with time arisen from the body and then was captured through technology and preserved through subsequent bodies, this would be more of a functionalist position. But in that case, the question would remain, what do you mean by you? This is not who you are. Was not your original consciousness tethered to the identity from which it arose? Or can it be transferred?
If your stack is destroyed, you die. In the universe of altered carbon, there's no coming back from real death. A cortical stack serves as a receptacle for the human consciousness, also known as digital human freight, DHF. All citizens within the protectorate have a cortical stack implanted inside of them on their first birthday. Composed of a non-terrestrial metal, left behind by an ancient alien civilization, cortical stacks were originally developed as a means of enabling the interstellar of far-off inhabitable planets. By downloading the human consciousness, cortical stacks are able to transmit a waiting body or a sleeve to a distinct planet intact. Thus, they enable instant travel to anywhere in the galaxy that would otherwise take centuries by traditional means. However, over time, another use was realized for this technology. For those who are able to afford it, cortical stacks can help achieve immortality. By resleeving their consciousness into new bodies, the rich are able to continue to live, even when their physical bodies perish. In fact, the wealthiest that use this service are even able to own a DHF backup in the event that their cortical stack is destroyed. This backup is updated every so often with recent memories and experiences via the process of needle casting or transmitting the digitized consciousness through a satellite.
Fascinating as it is as a sci-fi thriller, it does raise many mind-body questions. It doesn't seem clear as to whether the consciousness has arisen from the body to which it was initially tethered, or whether the consciousness exists apart from the body. If consciousness is only active while the body is active, and there is no soul that continues to experience anything after the body has perished, this would cause problems for mind-body dualism. However, given the fact that the consciousness is separable from body and does not rely on body to exist, this may cause problems for mind-body materialism. I leave it to you to ponder which perspective best aligns with the view presented in this film. Let us move on to ethical issues. If it is the case that strong artificial intelligence is possible, this will raise many significant ethical questions. If computers were to acquire minds, would we be obligated to include them within our moral community? If we can actually call it a person, should we treat it like one? Give it rights? If robots do advance to the point of having an animal-level intelligence, or being able to imitate human decision-making capabilities, or being able to satisfy basic cognitive conditions for what we call personhood, would we be morally obligated to give such machines basic rights? Would it be bigoted to think of ourselves as more valuable? What if artificial intelligence were to give rise to the sort of nightmarish takeovers upon which sci-fi films often capitalize? For example, The Matrix. Would we be morally responsible for having created the artificial intelligence? Or would the artificial intelligence, with their own minds, be morally responsible for their own actions? Who ought to be blamed for improper robotic conduct in war? Should we allow robot attack drones to make tactical wartime calculated decisions all by themselves? Questions abound, but our time is almost up, so let's move on. A few last questions to take with you. Since we don't have access to anyone else's subjective experience, but we know that subjective experience is an important aspect of consciousness, what shall we do with For example, reports of astral projection or significant experiences amidst deep meditation. What do we make of the claim that someone can see another's aura, or that the strength of one's chi can be felt? Or if someone says, I can sense that someone is talking about me over there or in the next room. Perhaps you felt like that. These are appeals to something other than that which is physically measurable. Moreover, they are appeals to subjectivity, which, as we said the other day, involves the problem of other minds. Even if it were possible to completely understand my own subjective experience, I have no access to that of another. What shall we do with claims of out-of-body experiences? Now, there are actually different types. There are subjective reports, and so someone just says they had an out-of-body experience, and perhaps we can say, well, I need to see some evidence, and we just brush it aside. But what would we do with near-death experiences that involve cases with apparent evidentiary support? If you want to look further into this, look into some of Gary Habermas's work on near-death experiences. He looks only at cases in which, for example, a patient is speaking of things happening elsewhere in the building, or on top of the roof, or down the street, or back at their family's house, and then after the person is resuscitated, these claims are empirically verified. Well, what do we do with that? And finally, what would we do with accounts of other non-material beings, angels, demons, ghosts, etc.? Just because we cannot empirically verify them, does this mean they're not there? Aren't we having the very same problem empirically verifying our own consciousness, the fact of our own subjective experience of which we are so certain? If I have no direct empirical access to the consciousness within a physical body, why would we think that we have access to empirically speak of the consciousness of an immaterial body? So if now and throughout history people have reported encounters with immaterial beings, and we just write off such things as impossible because it can't be physically measured, is this a problem with our methodology, or are we right to do so? And this is where I leave you. Next time we move on to a related problem, the problem of free will.
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?